probably have in our exhibit. Right? So for those of you that like vintage diving or want to try it, mark your calendars. April 11th, we're going to do a vintage dive day. We're going to have double hose regulators. We're going to have people in open bottom helmets so that you can see what that was like to be Art McKee salvage diving or William Beebe doing underwater marine biology. We're also going to have Sharky. Sharky is one of our board members. He's going to do a Mark V demonstration so people can see what it's like to dress the diver, get them into the water, what it's like to be underwater with them. So for any of you that are certified divers that are interested in doing that, that can be another experience. But April 11th, it's a Saturday. We're going to do it at Jules Undersea Lodge in the lagoon. It's a lot of fun. Check out our website, more details there. Also, for those of you that are in town, either live here or plan to come back, we on monthly weekends, we have guided tours. So normally it's self-guided every day, but if you come back, Julia does a tour at 11 and 2. So again, you just get some background information about new artifacts or different things that are already on display. So it's well worth, if you've been here on your own, coming back to do a guided tour. And if you haven't been here before, time it so that you can do a guided tour, because it's a lot more background information. And you know, we have 3,000 square feet of 5,000 years of history. There's a lot to see and read. And sometimes by the time you get to the big 1 atmosphere suits, you're just overwhelmed. So by having somebody kind of interpret some of that for you, it's just an added value to your experience. For those of you that will be here on the third Wednesday of April, we have Charlie Hudson, again, an author telling stories from the sea. She's written a couple of, somebody forgot their phone. She's written stories about the Spiegel Grove. She's about the different diving in the Keys. She's got a couple different books, and she's going to be our speaker next month. So, but the reason you came here tonight is the gentleman standing over here, Corey Malcom, who I have known since before I came to work at the History of Diving Museum. He is a Keys historian. He is a wealth of knowledge. He is very humble. He worked for the Mel Fisher group for years and years. Now he works for the county. He's a great historian. He's going to talk to us about German U-boats in the Keys. And I got to tell you, it's something that never crossed my mind. I've read a lot about World War II, a lot about things that have happened during that time frame. Did not think about them in my backyard. So if you have questions, would you prefer during the presentation or at the end?
Afterwards.
At the end. So kind of make a mental note. Also, if you're on YouTube, put them into the chat, because Julia is going to be moderating and she'll be bringing those into the room. If you're in the changing exhibit room, the same thing. We'll be getting the questions so that everybody can ask Corey while we have a captive audience and he's here. So all of that being said, I really like your smiling faces. We fed you a little bit. We gave you a little bit of drink. So now we get to hear about history. So Corey Malcom.
Thank you, Lisa. It's really nice to be here at the History of Diving Museum. Spoken here before, but I have to say, many years ago, I was working at the Mel Fisher Maritime Museum. I was there for decade. But I had a couple come visit, Sally and Joe Bauer, and they came in and they said, "We want to pick your brain. We're thinking about starting a museum about diving." And it's just so wonderful to see somebody's dream, that's what it was back then, come to a realization, and a realization as beautiful as this. So, I was walking through the exhibits, and boy, they should really be proud. It's really come together. So anyway, let me tell you a little bit about myself before we get going here. My name is Corey Malcom. I am the lead historian for the Florida Keys History Center. We are a division of the Monroe County Public Library system. We have our office and our archive in the back of the Key West Library, and we're open weekdays all day for people to drop in and ask us questions about history. Our mission, as you see up there, is to explore, preserve, promote, and make accessible the history of Monroe County, Florida. Like I say, our main mission is to help people that come to us, patrons with questions, but we do maintain an archive. We are constantly working towards acquiring new materials for that archive, new old materials for that archive. And we also do a lot of outreach. Every day we do This Day in Keys History. I know that's a pretty popular column, runs in the newspaper and all of our social media outlets. We have a very popular online photo gallery with 25,000 plus images of the Keys from the 1850s on up to probably 10 years ago. We also do a lot of outreach like I'm doing here this evening. So anything more you want to know about our organization, our office, keyslibraries.org/Keys History. You can contact me through there if you have any questions. All right. So tonight I'm going to be speaking about German U-boats in the Florida Keys. This is the first time I've done this talk, so you're guinea pigs here, all right? I'm going to try to stick to my notes to stay on time. If I do get a little chatty, I do promise I will have you out of here by 10 o'clock, all right? So let's talk a little bit about this. So German U-boats in the Florida Keys, a forgotten menace. Well, first, let's get to the basics. What's a U-boat, all right? That is what the Germans called an Unterseeboot, which just really means an undersea boat. All right, and so that was shortened to U-boat. Upon the U.S. entry into World War II, Nazi Germany began to attack shipping on the western side of the Atlantic with submarines, and the U.S. unfortunately was woefully unprepared for these attacks, and nearly 600 vessels were sunk and over 5,000 mariners killed. One historian has dubbed it the Atlantic Pearl Harbor. Terrible situation that happened in 1942 and 1943. But why is it forgotten? Well, it's forgotten largely because it was never remembered in the first place. Our government had an office of censorship, and they worked hand in hand with the press to kind of keep these stories on the down low, keep them suppressed. They didn't want the Germans to know if they were being successful or not, and didn't want to make it easy for them to know how they were progressing in their attacks. But they also didn't want stateside morale, to take a nosedive with people thinking, "Oh my God, we're under attack." A lot of these stories, they may have been presented in the newspaper, but only vaguely, and they never really caught hold in the public consciousness. And we really don't know these stories today because of that. All right, but they did happen, and I've done a lot of digging, and we will talk specifically about how U-boats were felt throughout the Florida Keys. I'm going to get back to the beginnings. We want to kind of start, start at the start and learn a little bit about U-boat history. Well, Germany was the last major European navy to adopt submarine technology, and this was their first submarine, the SMU-1, and it was commissioned in 1906. By the start of World War II, the Germans had been working on their submarine technology and really had developed some powerful machines. And they had submarines that were more sophisticated than any others anywhere. They could go further and dive deeper, and they were very effective attack craft. The first German attacks right after the war broke out were exclusively almost on British military craft. They were trying to stop Britain from being supplied and being defended, and they attacked a lot of the British Navy vessels. But as the months went on, they widened their attacks and began attacking any enemy ships. All right, and anything was fair game as long as it was from the other side. And in 1915, they sunk the passenger steamer Lusitania, which was really a terrible miscalculation on Germany's part because it galvanized opinion, particularly in the United States, against the Germans and almost drew the U.S. into the war, which Germany did not want at all. But U.S. was drawn into the war, and shortly after, the Germans sent their U-boats across the Atlantic to the U.S. coast. And we see in 1918, the first German U-boat arrived in American waters, and it sank off our shores. 13 ships laid mines in various American ports and severed 2 transatlantic telephone cables or submarine cables. So terrible damage, and the Germans didn't forget that lesson they learned. Now, at the end of the war, the Germans were forced, part of the Treaty of Versailles was that they had to give up all of their submarines. And so a few of them wound up in the United States. And we see the first U-boat arrive at Key West in 1919. And it was part of a victory loan drive. And they would send the sub around to different ports. And you can see Key Westers there clambered on board, took a tour of the enemy ship. But the real goal was to get them to give money to this victory loan drive to help relieve some of the nation's war debt. All right, so this is the first U-boat in the Florida Keys here in 1919. Now, Hitler, of course, greatly resented the Versailles Treaty and decided he was not going to live up to the agreement. And in 1935, he resurrected the submarine program and launched the U-1, which was the first of the World War II era, first Third Reich U-boats right there. Now, the Germans from 1935 until 1939, when the war broke out, did much as they had done in World War I, continued to add to their fleet and build up their fleet so they could be ready to attack enemy shipping. And we see the first attacks occur in the North Atlantic in September of 1939. And the main goal was once again to intercept supplies going into Great Britain. They wanted to crush the British, and they wanted to stop tankers from going in there and being able to fuel Britain's military machine, and they wanted to stop really all supplies going in there. So they sent their U-boats out into the North Atlantic and would torpedo them as they went in towards Britain. They were very successful. I don't know if you can tell the difference, but the blue dots were the sinking of Allied ships. The red dots were the sinking of U-boats. So you can see the ratio there was pretty skewed in Germany's favor. By 1941, the U.S. Reached an agreement where some of our military craft would serve as escorts for convoys going across the Atlantic towards Great Britain. And that vessel there on the lower left, that is the Ingham. If any of you have been to Key West and you've seen that historic Coast Guard vessel tied up along the Truman waterfront, well, the Ingham participated in these convoys and was there to help protect ships going into Great Britain, and was actually credited with the sinking of a U-boat in 1943. So the Ingham is a big part of this story in a different part of the Atlantic. Now, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States enters World War II. 4 days later, Germany declares war against the United States on December 11th. We see just within weeks, in January of 1942, the first U-boat attacks along the U.S. coast. Now, the Germans called this Operation Paukenschlag, which means drumbeat. All right. It was also known to them as the second happy time. The first happy time was that great success in the North Atlantic, shooting ships going into Britain. Now they came across to the U.S., to Canada, and they were able to shoot ships, or sink ships at will almost, in what they called the second happy time. We see the first attacks in Florida in February. The first one occurred off the Daytona Space Coast area, but here we see a telegram about a sinking of a sub off Jacksonville, and it's kind of interesting because it does talk about how the submarine probably used the lights from the amusement parks along Jacksonville Beach to silhouette the ships. They would put the ship between the shore and themselves, and then they could see the silhouette of a ship, even if it was blacked out, because of the lights. And that was a big problem. The U.S. learned pretty quickly, hey, we got to do blackouts because these ships can use our lights against. So an important lesson there. Now, also in February of 1942, the Gulf Sea Frontier was organized, and this was put together, opened its office on February 6, 1942, and was headquartered at Key West. And the Gulf Sea Frontier was a Navy office that was in charge of this region here, running from the North Florida border out past the northern Bahamas, back towards the northern coast of Cuba, and then covered the western end of Cuba and the entirety of the Gulf of Mexico through the Yucatan. Their job there was to monitor ships sailing through those waters and also to coordinate patrols to help protect those ships. The problem was, in 1942, at the beginning, there really weren't enough assets here. There weren't enough Navy vessels. There weren't enough planes to really effectively keep an eye on what was going on. And the Germans were able largely to go through these waters without being detected. So how did they fight against what weapons were used against U-boats? Well, we see on the left depth charges. These were basically bombs that were dropped into the water, drum-shaped bombs. They had a setting that you could adjust, and when the depth charge reached a certain depth, that setting would determine when it exploded. So you could set it to 20 feet or you could set it to 300 feet. And when it reached that depth, it would explode and hopefully damage the U-boat enough that it would sink. There was artillery. There were also hedgehog charges that were thrown off the vessels as well. You see aircraft could drop depth bombs, same principle. They drop a bomb, it would go under the water and explode. And then, of course, probably one of the more effective tools was convoys, where ships would gather as a group and be escorted by military craft as they crossed to their destination. So those were the four big ones, but there were also mines. And this is a device that would be dropped off a vessel. It had an anchor mooring, a big heavy weight at the bottom. that would sink to the bottom. The mine would then be suspended in the water column, and you see the little like antennas coming off the top of the mine. If a ship bumped those antennas, they would bend, and that would cause either a chemical or an electrical reaction that would then detonate the mine. So a ship would sail along, bump the mine, and it would explode, and the ship would sink. It was a pretty common tool then, common tool today, and they used these in Key West. The Navy laid in April of 1942, they laid 3,640 mines in 3 areas, north and west of Smith Shoal, just north of Key West. The goal was to provide a safe anchorage for convoys, and they used the natural reefs and shoals of the Keys to give protection to the south and the east. So you can see the danger area was the minefield, but on the left-hand image, you see a little passage right through the minefield. That's how ships were supposed to get in and out. You can see that's a pretty tight passage, and it really, in quick order, wreaked havoc. And we see, starting in April 26, 1942, the U.S. destroyer Sturdivant hit 2 mines and was sunk. In roughly 3 weeks later, the Gunboat, a cargo ship, hit a mine and sunk. And just 4 days after that, the Bosilka, same thing. And then at the beginning of July, the Edward Luckenbach struck mines as well and sank. So within just a few weeks, 4 ships were sunk, all of them accidentally, because they just misnavigated that passage coming in. So the minefield worked, but just not in the ways. Now we see another accident up in the upper Keys here off Key Largo. And this happened also in April of 1942 when the Benwood, a 360-foot steam freighter sailing from Tampa with a cargo of phosphate, was running along the Keys up here without lights per wartime regulations, sailing dark. They encountered off Key Largo the 528-foot tanker Robert C. Tuttle, which was also running unlit. The vessel put out signals, but they were misinterpreted by both crews, and that misinterpretation put the 2 onto a collision course. And shortly after, Benwood's bow plowed into the Tuttle, damaged the freighter, and it sank in half an hour in 25 to 45 feet of water between French Reef and Dixie Shoals. It's now in what is known as John Pennekamp Coral Reef State Park, and is one of the most popular dive sites within that park. So a piece of World War II history right there in Pennekamp Park. Now, in May of 1942, these U-boats had been working along the east coast of the United States, but in May of 1942, we see the first entry of a U-boat into the Gulf of Mexico. It was by the U-507, and it was the first of 24 U-boats to make it through into the Gulf of Mexico. The Germans had learned that their subs could go further than they initially thought, and especially with the aid of refueling tanker subs that they called milk cows. And so a sub like the U-507 would come up along the milk cow, take on new fuel, and it could go even farther. And they did. So we see the U-507. You can see some of the specs there. It gives you a sense of how U-boats could operate. So U-507 had the captain of 52 men. It was 249 feet long, 22-foot beam. It carried only 22 torpedoes, which is important because they had to use them sparingly. They couldn't just go out and blast away. They had to think before they fired a torpedo whether it was worth a shot. And they also had a couple of guns on deck, and they could go as deep as 750 feet. It's amazing. The U-boats generally operated on the surface. They didn't operate underwater. They only did that for short periods and for just to avoid being attacked. Generally, they cruised on the surface, and that's usually how they attacked, was from the surface. But you can see U-507 had a range of 13,400. That's a long way. So impressive craft. This is the route the U-507 took into Mexico, came through the Bahamas, the pass along the southern Bahamas, reached the eastern coast of Cuba, quickly encountered a small freighter there. They decided to sink it, but they didn't use a torpedo. They used their gun, and they were able to sink the freighter there. Sailed along the north coast of Cuba, attacked a couple of other ships, missed them both, but word must have gotten out, and it caused alarm. And we see then went on past the Tortugas and into the Gulf of Mexico. In the U-507's log, the captain says very specifically that the lights, all the navigational lights of the Florida Keys were lit, and he wrote as if in peacetime. So people weren't, they knew this stuff was going to happen, but they still didn't adapt quickly enough to prevent attacks. So in Key West, we see on May 4th or May 3rd, 1942, they must have gotten word, and they quickly ordered, without prior warning, it says, a blackout of the city. Unfortunately, a fire broke out at the same time, and so the blackout was sort of a bit of a wash. But you do see some of the defensive maneuvers happening here. Now, U-507 passed the Tortugas and then found its first victim, the Norlindo. On May 4th at 5:42 p.m., 80 miles west of the dry Tortugas, the U-507 came across the American tanker Norlindo carrying 4,800 barrels of fuel oil. One torpedo was fired at Norlindo. That torpedo found its target, and the vessel went down in minutes. 5 men were killed. 23 men went into the life rafts. The U-507 approached those men in the rafts, and Captain Schacht of the U-507 gave them cigarettes, crackers, and lime juice. And he said, "I hope you get to shore okay. Sorry, we cannot help you further." And that was it. And they went on, continued their cruise, and about 6 hours later, they encountered another tanker, the Munger T. Ball, 5,100 ton tanker loaded with gasoline, sailing from Texas to Virginia. This vessel, like so many of them, was unescorted, sailing on its own, not part of a convoy, and really, because of that, was just a sitting duck. The Munger T. Ball, they fired one torpedo, and the ball exploded. And as Captain Schacht wrote, there was a mushroom cloud of smoke. The ship was surrounded by burning gasoline, preventing the escape of most of the crew. And of the 41 men on board, 37 of them died. There was another tanker not far away that saw the attack on the Munger T. Ball and called out an alarm on the radio and said, there's a U-boat in the area, and we just saw a ship get attacked. And they said that they were 9 miles away from the attack point and 65 miles northwest of the Tortugas. Well, with that information, Harold Schacht was listening on the U-507 to the radio communication. He said, "Okay, there's my next victim." He headed that way, scanned the horizon, and found the Joseph M. Cutting steaming through the Gulf. The crew of the cutter, he knew that they were being followed, and so they began evasive maneuvers. The 507 fired a torpedo. It missed, but at 4:24 in the morning, they got in closer, fired a second torpedo, and it struck. And as Schock wrote in his log, hit center. The steamer exploded and immediately burst into flames, forward and aft. The Cudahy remained afloat for many days afterwards before being purposely sunk by the U.S. Navy on May 9th. The U-507, after sinking the Cudahy, carried on and went into the Gulf of Mexico as far as the Mississippi River, sinking ships all along the way. It finally was time to turn around, running low on fuel and torpedoes, and so they basically turned around and exited the way they came in, right past the Keys, on into the Gulf Stream current, and they returned to their base in northern France. Survivors from these ships and really all others that were sunk within the Gulf Sea region, they were brought to Key West to various hospitals here. And it's interesting. I know you can't really read the text in these captions, but this is a good illustration of how that office of censorship worked. We know that there were some ships that were torpedoed. We know that there were survivors that were rescued, but very rarely does it give the ship's name and never gives the location of where this happened. So all readers knew was that, yes, there were some ships torpedoed, some people survived, they were taken to Key West, and that was it. There was really no specifics. And so, people, unless you saw it directly, you didn't know what happened. A month after the U-507, just 10 days after the U-507 sank those three ships by the Tortugas, we see another vessel struck. The Potrero de Llano, sunk by the U-564 off the other end of the Florida Keys, very near Fowey Rocks. All right. It was so close to Miami that people in office buildings there could see the flames and the smoke, and took pictures of the Potrero del Llano as it was sinking. So another terrible tragedy. This was a Mexican ship carrying 35,000 barrels of fuel oil, and the sinking of this vessel actually drew Mexico into World War II. We see later in June a very interesting event take place when the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Thetis actually encountered and sank a U-boat. June 1st, 1942, the U-157 departed Lorient in northern France, and its goal was to reach the Mississippi River, the mouth of the river where there were lots of ships and they could pretty much sink them unimpeded. By June 10th, they were off the north coast of Cuba. They torpedoed and sank the 6,400-ton tanker Hagen off of Cuba, and that alerted the Gulf Sea frontier, and orders were given for the submarine to be hunted and destroyed by U.S. forces. An Army Air Force B-18 out of Key West spotted the sub on June 11th. They dropped 4 depth bombs. All of them missed. Hours later, a Pan Am passenger plane saw the U-boat on the surface, and they called in the location. The Gulf Sea frontier ordered 14 anti-submarine warfare vessels to the area, including the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Thetis, 165-foot B-class cutter. On June 13th, as they patrolled looking for the sub, at 4 p.m., the Thetis's sound man picked up a strong contact. They used sonar to detect these submarines underwater. They got a signal and said, okay, this thing's close. They ordered immediately a depth charge attack, and 7 charges were dropped at 5-second intervals from racks at the stern of the Thetis, and 2 more from the bow. Those were set to explode at 200 and 300 feet. They went off, and after the detonation, oil and debris roiled to the surface. and including leather pants, wood planking, and a grease gun that read "Made in Dusseldorf." Thetis got the kill, and the sinking of the U-157 was the first submarine casualty of Germany's Gulf and Caribbean campaign. But that didn't stop them. 2 days later, June 16th, the SS Managua, a 2,200 Nicaraguan merchant steamer, was torpedoed at 4 a.m. by the U-67. All hands made it into lifeboats. You can see they were south of Key West, about 30, 40 miles. All hands made it into the lifeboats. Those lifeboats were stopped by the captain of the U-67, and they were interrogated as to the vessel's mission, its cargo, and its nationality. And once they were satisfied with the answers, the lifeboats were let go. Some of them made it to Cuba. Another made it to Pigeon Key. A month later, the attacks continue, this time southwest of the Dry Tortugas, when the tanker Pennsylvania Sun was attacked. It was steaming unescorted from Texas to Ireland with 108,000 barrels of fuel oil. It was torpedoed by the U-571, 125 miles west of Key West, and it was immediately engulfed in flames. 2 men were killed, but 57 survived and were rescued and taken to Key West. The Pennsylvania Sun amazingly remained afloat, and the flames were eventually extinguished. The vessel was towed into Key West for temporary repairs. The bodies on board were removed for burial. And eventually, the Pennsylvania Sun was fully repaired and was in service for another 20 years. Rare case there. Now, we see a lot of activity by the Gulf Sea frontier, but there were also a lot of civilian patrols that participated in this anti-submarine effort. And here we see the civilian air patrols, where people with private planes, they would go out and they would just back and forth across the Straits of Florida looking for submarines. In the center there, you see a ground observation corps tower. This is in the Keys here. This was called the George Marshall Observation Tower. It was located at mile marker 91 Oceanside, which would put it at the southwestern end of Tavernier. All right. I don't think it's there anymore. I haven't looked, but it looks like it's in pretty bad shape there. Anyway, so they would set up in that tower and just scan the horizon, looking for any suspicious activity, which they could then radio in to the Gulf Sea frontier. And we also see a lot of the local working vessels that were sort of deputized to be part of what they called the picket fleet or hooligan navy. And this is the schooner Western Union out of Key West. We also see the turtle schooner that would go down to Nicaragua and get turtles to come back to Key West. That was also out looking for submarines as they did their work. So an effective way to employ civilian assets to keep an eye on the waters that the Navy could not cover completely. Now, I can't talk about the hooligan Navy without talking about our friend Ernest Hemingway. He participated in this, and it's kind of an interesting story. He put together a program that he dubbed Operation Friendless. And in the summer of 1942, Hemingway, of course, always looking for adventure, approached the Navy and the Office of National Intelligence, went to D.C., met with some folks there, and he told them he had a plan to use his fishing boat, Pilar, to search for Nazi submarines in the Florida Straits. He told them he would like to arm the vessel with Thompson submachine guns and grenades. And then, with his boat being rather small and innocuous, he thought he could approach the U-boats if he saw them and then attack with, by I guess, throwing grenades into their snorkels and shooting any men that came out. the plan was absolutely harebrained, but the military brass thought, well, it's worth a gamble. If Hemingway can pull this off, that would be a huge story and a big boost for morale. So they said, okay, do it. And they assigned a Marine to the Pilar. They gave him the munitions. They gave him radio equipment. And off Ernest Hemingway went for a year and a half patrolling the Florida Straits between here and Cuba, looking for Nazi submarines. He did see one. It was about 6 miles away, and he couldn't do anything about it, and it submerged, and so he really got nowhere. And finally, in January of 1944, he realized, okay, this is all over, and so wrapped it up, put Pilar into dry dock, and changed the engine because he had run it so hard for a year and a half. So anyway, Hemingway's fruitless mission to find Nazi submarine. Now, we see in August of 1942, these attacks continue, and this is a fascinating story because by this time they were employing the convoy system. So ships would gather as a group in Key West. They would depart Key West with military escorts and go to whatever their destination was. And the U-boats found it very hard to attack these groups without being caught or seen or intercepted. And it was really showing some good results. But on August 12th of 1942, 7 merchant vessels escorted by 2 Navy craft left Key West for Havana at 6 in the morning. The group this convoy was designed to deliver newly developed radio equipment for an advanced base somewhere in Cuba. And it was highly classified equipment, so it was put on the 2 oldest and slowest vessels in the convoy, the Manzanillo and the Santiago de Cuba, 2 Cuban freighters. And they were then positioned in the center of the convoy. 2 hours later, the group was about 15 miles south of Key West, and they were attacked by a U-boat, the 508. And the 508 torpedoed only the Manzanillo and the Santiago de Cuba. Both vessels sank. They left all the others alone, and they made it safely to Havana. Now, there were fears, justly warranted fears, that there had been some sort that this was a targeted attack that was the result of espionage, and investigations were held to determine if that was indeed the case, but there was never any source of a leak or a breach that was ever found. So a terrible tragedy that may have had some dark undertone. Now you can see this happened on the chart just south of Key West. For years, I've been in Key West a long time, and for years I've always heard from old timers, oh yeah, we saw the ships blown up offshore, and during World War II, we could see that. And I always kind of doubted them, but then when you plot the location of this, absolutely, this is one that people could have seen. It happened at roughly 8, 9 in the morning, and people could have easily seen this from the southern shore of Key West. One interesting thing, too, that I heard from an eyewitness, my landlady, she's passed away since, but she said, yes, that she saw these ships burning on the horizon. But she also said during that summer, the beaches were always covered in oil and tar. And that makes perfect sense because so many of these tankers carrying petroleum products. So something I'd never really considered. Anyway, that was largely the end of the peak attacks. We can see this chart. This comes from a Navy report written in 1945, and you can see the attacks within the Gulf Sea frontier in 1942. And May was the peak, June was strong, July, but by August that convoy system is really working. And the attacks diminished significantly. But that didn't stop the Germans. They simply would regroup, and they wanted to continue to send U-boats over here because they didn't want the U.S. to think, okay, the American side attacks are over. They can now use their assets in Europe. They wanted to keep American assets tied up over here. So they would send U-boats to go and attack vessels. And we had to maintain a force on this side to counter. So we do see attacks happening in the Keys here, April 3rd, 1943, 40 miles southeast of here. We see the Gulf State, another tanker, 7,000 tons, struck by two torpedoes fired by the U-155. The Gulf State sank quickly in 4 minutes. The lifeboats, unfortunately, were burned in the torpedoing, and they couldn't be used. And the 61 men on board were forced to swim through a 600-foot ring of burning oil that was surrounded the ship. Out of the 43 men on board, out of the 61 men on board, 43 were killed. And the survivors, they couldn't use life rafts, so they just grabbed onto any flotsam that they could find. And this is actually a photograph of when they were discovered by the rescue craft. You can see they're hanging on to anything that will keep them afloat. So a terribly sad tale, just south of here. The last U-boat engagement in the Florida Keys happened in July of 1943, and it is a crazy story. This occurred when on the evening of July 18th, 1943, when a 250-foot long helium-filled Navy blimp K-74 left Naval Air Station Richmond, which is where Metro Zoo is in Miami today. They left for an anti-sub patrol over to the Florida Straits. They were to take the blimp and go back and forth and look for submarines. Near midnight, they got a radar contact. And so they decided to pursue that contact. And on approach, it was absolutely clear it was a U-boat cruising on the surface. Now, the U-boat didn't see them. Of course, they were very quiet and floating up there in the air. And the Lieutenant Grills, who was in command of the K-74, he could see up ahead, though, that the U-134 was heading toward a nearby tanker and freighter, and he just thought, oh my gosh, those are the next victims. And so he decided, even though it was highly unorthodox for a blimp to attack a submarine, he decided he had no choice. He had to take action. And so they came up behind the U-134, and within 250 yards, they opened fire and got some good hits on the sub, but that also alerted the crew that, hey, we're under attack. So they came out and they fired back, and both vessels were struck. It was quite the show. So both vessels were damaged. Now the blimp tried to drop depth charges. Unfortunately, the bomb release is jammed, so the charges never dropped. And in the firefight, the blimp's envelope was punctured and its starboard engine was destroyed. The airship was uncontrollable with that, and it eventually dropped into the water. Most of the men stayed with the airbag until it sank about 8 hours later. Lieutenant Grills decided that he was going to swim away from the blimp, and he was going to try to swim to the key. So he set out on his own. Eventually, all the men were rescued by Navy vessels, except for one man who was eaten by a shark. Now, it wasn't known until years later that after the blimp was down, the U-134 surfaced, went to the site, and actually salvaged items from the blimp. And they only figured that out because they took photographs of the operation. The film was given to one of the milk cow tankers, and they took that then to Germany, and the photos were developed and stored in an archive there. So the guys on board, the blimp crew, they had no clue that the sub had approached them, but it did. There's photographic evidence there. Now, there was debate as to whether the K-74 crew acted properly, but they were vindicated later when the U-134 was sunk in the Bay of Biscay by a British aircraft. And it was because the U-134 or U-134 was unable to dive because of damage inflicted by the blimp. So when the blimp started shooting at the sub, they damaged their quick dive equipment, and the vessel couldn't submerge quickly to avoid being fired upon further. It was years later, but Lieutenant Grills got the last laugh, and he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role in that kill. So they went from almost court-martialing him to giving him the Distinguished Flying Cross. It's a wonderful little graphic here. This was printed in the Key West Citizen in 1945, when they could at last talk about what had happened in the area here. And you see all these dots showing various U-boat attacks. Now, not all of them were sinking, but attacks where they tried to fire a torpedo and it either hit it or not. And you see most of them happened in 1942. The X's show what happened in 1943. But my gosh, that's a lot of attacks. So anyway, of course, May 1945, Germany surrenders, and we have VE Day. Part of the deal in Germany's surrender, much like during World War I, they were forced to surrender their U-boats. All right, and we see a lot of those U-boats were then divvied up amongst the Allied Navy, and the U.S. Navy got a few for its collection, and they were very happy to get these because these U-boats at the end of the war were these new Type 21 U-boats. They were electric, and they could go deeper and cruise farther than any submarine before, and they had never really been put into combat. And so these were brand new submarines off the line, the latest, greatest technology. And it was important for our Navy to get their hands on these modern marvels and sort of reverse engineer them and be able to adapt these technologies to our fleet. So here we see 3 U-boats tied up. They just crossed the Atlantic, and they're in Portsmouth. We see the U-2513 on the left, the U-3008 in the center, and the U-505 on the right. And all 3 of those subs wound up in Key West. The first was a U-505, came here in December of 1945. Much like we saw in 1919, it was part of a Victory Loan bond drive. Brought it in, let people tour the submarine, and then they would give money to help pay off the national debt. Now, the U-505, I've actually been with this, and some of you may have as well. If you've ever been to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, the U-505 is on display there, and you can go down in it and tour through it. So as a kid, I was on this. I would appreciate it much more now, but it's cool to know that it's available. Now we see the U-3008 arrive in Key West in April of 1947. It was delivered here to develop submarine and anti-submarine tactics. And it was here until October of 1947, went north, returned in March of the following year, and was employed with the Operational Development Force here until June. The U-3008 eventually went to Portsmouth, and it was used as a training hulk there, and eventually scrapped in 1956. Now we see the U-2513 here in Key West. This is came in the fall of 1946. This is probably pretty close to its arrival here in the Keys. Beautiful photograph, and it has another pretty interesting story associated with it. So again, it was here to figure out how it worked, and also put it out there for exercises, anti-submarine warfare exercise. But in November 21st of 1946, somebody had the bright idea that it would be cool to take President Harry Truman on a ride on the U-2513. And so Truman, with his aides, his other staff, and military brass, got on the 2513, went out past the reef off Key West into 1,000 feet of water, and they took the sub down to a depth of 440 feet. The vessel remained submerged for about 45 minutes. And Truman, was loving every minute of it. As they were surfacing, one of the engine rooms flooded, and it sent smoke out into one of the battery areas. Scary moment there, but they surfaced safely. And then a planned anti-submarine exercise was performed as they steamed back into Key West Harbor. And they fired artillery and dropped depth charges within 2,000 yards of the president on the submarine. This would never happen today. And remember this, in Truman's first term, he had no vice president. So this was a ridiculous risk. Anyway, they made it, so the U-2513 did its duty here, and lived out the rest of its life here in the Keys. By 1951, it had outlived its usefulness, and on October 7th of 1951, it was sunk in rocket tests by the U.S. Navy destroyer off the Dry Tortugas. It's rested there ever since, in just a little over 200 feet of water west of the Dry Tortugas. In the 2010s, I don't know the exact year, but the Ocean Education Trust, with their Nautilus Live program, visited the wreck. They live streamed video of their tour. It was really cool to watch. I mean, they took a lot of photographs and mapped the site as well. So it is out there, and it looks like this. So that's pretty neat to know. Now, a lot of these stories that I've been telling this evening involve tankers. All right, vessels carrying petroleum products of some sort. Well, they're sunk, and a lot of them went down with a fair amount of their petroleum cargo, and this can be a problem. And so NOAA has made an assessment of all these various wrecks, even if they don't know exactly where they are, to try to determine what would happen if these vessels rotted away or broke open in a storm and their cargo was dispersed. And so here we see the report for the Norlindo, sunk by the U-507 early on, the first victim in the Gulf, and what would happen if its oil leaked out, where it would be dispersed. So this could be a big problem. And there is an active effort to try to find these vessels and remove their hazardous cargo. And in 2021, there was a wreck. People knew about it for years, called the oil wreck out past the Tortugas, that was constantly leaking oil. You can see the photo of the oil sheen coming up. In 2021, a team from the Coast Guard, from the Navy, from NOAA, and Resolve Marine went to this site and they determined that it was likely the Munger T. Ball, one of the early victims in May of 42. Decided that, okay, we're going to get all of this petroleum product out of this vessel. And so they did. They pumped out 35,000 gallons of fuel. But we can see, this is one case, and we see all these other sinking. So this is going to be a persistent issue for the foreseeable future. So if more of these can be located, hopefully they can get the oil out of it. So, as we can see by this map, the Florida Keys were a significant frontier in Operation Drumbeat in the Battle of the Atlantic. Though they might not be well remembered, German U-boats affected the entirety of our island chain. And the stories are not just distant memories. At every one of these sites that you see on this chart, there are physical reminders somewhere near of the oceanic battlefront, and they remain with us today. That leaves us much more to learn. Thank you. I will take any questions, as long as you're not a World War II vet. Yes, sir. So the question was, is there any evidence that the U-boat crews came to shore in the United States? That's a story that's been told many times. I can see just from what I've looked at that happened 2 times. Once in New York and somewhere in the Gulf, but that's it. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So the question is have there been studies done to determine water quality near where these sinkings have occurred? And honestly, I can't answer that. I know NOAA has done a lot of work into that subject, and I would defer to them. A lot of their reports are online. But as far as I can tell, the supposed Munger T. Ball is the only one that's really been pumped out. Yeah. Yes, sir.
When did the U.S. decode their radio transmission and start listening in?
Yeah, so that's a good question. When did the U.S. start to decode the German communications? And that was a big issue. The Germans used in their communications what were called Enigma machines. And they would type in a communication that would be coded in this seemingly garbled transcript sent to home base, and they would decrypt it there. And it took years, 2 solid years at least, for the Allies to be able to decode the communication sent out by these Enigma machines. And that was a problem, because they had no idea what these U-boats were saying to one another and to home base. Once they cracked that code, though, a couple of years later, that spelled bad news for the U-boat. Yes.
Do they know how long the boats could stay underwater with, like the air scrubbing and?
Yeah, so not as long as you would think, and they would usually just do a matter of hours underwater, maybe 6 hours or so. Then they would have to come to the surface and recharge their batteries and get fresh air and all of that. So U-boats were submerged or were on the surface much, much, much more than they were ever underwater.
So I do have a question from Zoom.
Yeah.
Charles asks, where and how did the U-boats refuel?
Well, their home port was in Lorient, France. All right, so they were at the northwestern tip of France, and that is where they had the big U-boat bunkers, and they would steam out from there. But they also had the milk cow tankers. These were specially designed subs that simply carried a large amount of fuel, and they would meet the U-boats mid-ocean or mid-Gulf, in our case here, and refuel them so they could go even farther. So those were the two big sources. Yes, in the back.
Within the last 1 to 2 decades, Have they tried, has anybody tried diving the U-157?
Yes, the one out past there, well, U-157, no, that's the one south. That's in thousands of feet of water. It's probably like between 3,000 and 5,000 feet of water. That would be a fascinating site to discover, and I'm sure someday some submersible is going to come across it. But for now, nobody has seen it. The U-2513 past the Tortugas, that is accessible to divers, and tech diving teams will go out there and dive on that. It's just in over 200 feet. But the 157 would be a fascinating wreck to find. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the milk cows.
Yes.
They didn't submerge, and they must have been a little slow with all the.
Yeah,
Why
absolutely.
didn't press go after them?
I mean, they couldn't really go after much of anything early on, and so like the attack U-boats, the milk cows evaded detection, so they could submerge too. I mean, they were submarines, absolutely. Yeah. So
If anybody else has any questions, we are going to be putting the chairs away. Corey's going to be here for a few minutes. But we also want to thank you for coming to the History of Diving Museum. We have a little gift for you. So we have a hat for him to keep that sun off of his eyes while he's in the Keys, and a 1-year membership in case he wants to come up here and do any research in the research library, which would be beneficial for the Keys as well as our historian.
thank you.
So thank you very much for
Thank
being
you.
here.
Thank you, everybody.